This is from Exodus chapter 9 and Psalm 86. God said, "Now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. 'I am has sent me to you.'" God also said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, 'The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation.'" And then the call from the psalmist, "Teach me your way, Lord, that I may rely on your faithfulness. Give me an undivided heart, that I may fear your name. I will praise you, Lord my God, with all my heart. I will glorify your name forever. For great is your love toward me. You have delivered me from the depths, from the realm of the dead. Arrogant foes are attacking me, O God. Ruthless people are trying to kill me. They have no regard for you. But you, Lord, are a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in love and faithfulness. Turn to me and have mercy on me. Show your strength in behalf of your servant. Save me, because I serve you, just as my mother did." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Back when I was in college, I learned a lesson. It's a valuable life lesson. And I almost learned it the hard way. A group of friends and I went to the Dollar Theater. You know the Dollar Theater? The theater where you go and pay $1 for movies that have been out too long to pay top dollar for them. Well, the people down the street pay top dollar, $8, $9, $10 to go see the new ones. Well, because you're only paying $1, sometimes there's a slightly different clientele at the Dollar Theater than there is at the nicer theater. And so, anyway, a group of friends and I went to this Dollar Theater, and we were seeing what was the top movie at the time. Ended up winning the Oscar for Best Picture. I mean, it was a wonderful, epic movie. And we sat down toward the front. Well, I was used to people texting or talking on the phone or talking to their neighbor during the movie, but what I was not prepared for is the guy in the back that was just disregarding all movie etiquette. I mean, he was loud and he was obnoxious. He was laughing at inappropriate moments. I mean, the sound would be down and he would just laugh. And I thought, what is this guy looking at on his phone? See, like that. He's laughing at inappropriate times. And he's clearly not paying attention to the movie. Or he would shout to a friend of his across the room, "Hey, man!" And then when the hero of the movie would do something good, he would just go crazy. "Yeah, that's what I'm talking about!" And so I just sat there in this movie getting angrier and angrier. Like, how could this guy have no decency? He's ruining the movie for everybody else. And so I decided that when the movie ended, I was going straight back there, and that guy was going to get a piece of my mind. And so the movie ended, and the lights went up, and I didn't wait for everybody to politely get up. I stood, and I walked furious and convicted to the back of the auditorium where that guy was sitting, and I found him, and I looked him straight in the eyes, and he looked up at me from his wheelchair. It was a special needs adult who was there with a group of patients from a local care center. Needless to say, I did not give that man a piece of my mind because I realized that I had known a part of that guy's story. And I had filled in all the rest with what I thought was going on, with what I assumed that guy was thinking, and all his motives and everything else. and I almost made a horrible mess of things. Do you ever do that? You ever do that in life? We got some people nodding. We do that in the good way, we do it in the bad way. We sometimes can make people out to be superheroes when we know just a little piece of their story. Like, how many times have you heard about or been the person who meets the man or woman of your dreams? Oh, and they are beautiful inside and out, and your personalities just mesh so nicely, and you could spend days or weeks or months in their presence, and it goes by like a flash, an instant, a blink of the eyes. They're just perfect. And then a day or a week or a month or years down the road, you find out that thing about their personality, or that criminal record they didn't tell you about, or the child that they knew they had but you didn't, or whatever. I mean, you've heard the horror stories, you've lived them out. Or what about the parent whose child is perfect in their own eyes, can do no wrong? They know the part of the story that is their child, the apple of their eye who lives at home, but they don't know what happens outside of it. So everything that happens wrong is the other kid's fault. And if every child was just as good and perfect and well-behaved and well-mannered and moral and ethical as my child, the world would be a wonderful place. And they are indignant when the principal calls them in to learn about what their child has done, and they sit down ready to defend their child and tell the truth. And then they see the security footage. Oh, you mean that little piece of what I know about my kid isn't the whole story? And we do it to make people awful in our minds. Like the friend I had who was separated and divorced from her spouse, and he was evil. And all I ever heard was her version of what had happened and how everything had gone wrong. And I mean, he was just evil incarnate. He was Satan. He was hell on earth. And then I got assigned to do a project with him through a set of circumstances. And it turns out he was a really good guy. He was nice. Like, I liked him. I didn't want to like him. I wanted to hate him because I already knew what I needed to know about him, and I filled in the rest. And he was a jerk, except he wasn't. The problem, though, is that this is a common problem when we do it with other people, but I think in the church, we're doing it with Jesus. Here's what I mean. We know a part of Jesus' story really, really well. How many of you grew up in a church? Just raise your hand. Almost everybody here. Well, see if your experience is the same as mine. On Sunday morning, the sermons came almost exclusively from one of three sources. It was either the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. I just did 5 on my fingers. There are 4. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or the writings of Paul, usually Romans. Romans was the book, man. And a lot of times Romans chapter 8. Go Romans chapter 8, teach you everything you need to know. So the 4 Gospels and Romans and Revelation. That was our sources of truth. I'm seeing some heads nodding, so you've lived this maybe. So if it wasn't for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Romans, or Revelation, we really didn't know what was going on. So we had this sliver of the piece of Jesus' story. We knew part of his story really, really well. At best, we knew from birth to his death and then the life of the church and kind of this future vision really, really well. And then we filled in the rest with what we thought was going on. Like when Jesus had really confusing interactions or conversations or said something that we didn't understand, we just filled in the facts with what we knew, about him. He's a nice guy. He doesn't do mean things. We'll fill in this. And my fear is that we haven't really understood Jesus to begin with. We've understood a part of his story, filled in the rest with what we want it to be, and then made that the truth, except it's not. And we've said that the point of this sermon series is to figure out if believing in Christianity makes sense. And at the heart of Christianity is Jesus, is this guy Jesus. And so if we want to understand if Christianity actually makes sense, we have to make sense of Jesus. But we only have part of his story. or we've only really engaged with part of his story. To truly understand Jesus, you have to dig into the stuff that we haven't dug into a lot. Because Jesus, I always had this view when I was a kid, like Jesus was just dropped out of heaven into a stable in Bethlehem in 1 AD, and that was the start of the really good stuff. So the stuff before it didn't really matter. But just like you and me, I mean, Jesus has a story. Jesus has a people. He has a culture. He came from a place, and he believed he had come from a certain place and was doing certain things. And we have to understand where he came from and what he thought he was doing and what he thought he was if we're going to actually understand him. And so that means we have to dig into the Old Testament, to the story of Israel, to the story of Jesus' people. Because I don't think you can understand Jesus unless you understand that story. And you might say, well, I've read the Old Testament. Have you really? Like, I've read the children's Old Testament that my kids have, like the high points. I've read the action stories, like David and Goliath and Daniel in the lion's den, that make God look awesome and make us feel really good and reassured. And I've read the parts that are awful. I mean, the truly, truly bad parts of the Old Testament that people lift up and say, see, God is a monster. How could you dare follow a God like that? I've read those. But I don't know that I've understood the story arc. I mean, the whole thing. And a Jew or a Christian in the first century would not have rolled out David and Goliath to tell you about what God was doing in the world. They would have told the story a certain kind of way, and so we have to hear the story that way if we're going to understand it and understand where Jesus was coming from and what he was doing. And again, if we're telling you as a church that this voice is worth investing your entire life in, isn't it worth learning the story? You know, like this is a life or death proposition. So here is the story as they would have told it. It starts off in the same place that you probably have read 100 times, Genesis chapter 1 through 3. We can get that far in our Read the Bible in a Year plan. Usually we don't bog down until Leviticus or Numbers, so you've probably read this part of the Old Testament story. Genesis 1, 2, 3, God creates this world. We know this, speaks it into existence, and then declares that it is very good, and it's wonderful, and it's perfect, and everything works in harmony. God and people and creation and the animals and everything else. Animals don't even hunt each other in the original thing. I think that's fascinating, but it's also beside the point. But he creates this wonderful thing, and then sin is introduced in Genesis chapter 3, and everything goes to pot, and it slowly deteriorates and falls apart. In Genesis 4, you have the first murder, where Cain murders his brother Abel. In chapter 6, God is sad that he made the whole thing, wipes the slate almost clean, but keeps Noah's family. But from 6 to Genesis 11, things just devolve, and they keep falling apart, until in Genesis chapter 11, the people are so warped in their spirituality that they actually try to build a tower to reach up to the heavens, to touch God. That's the story that we know as the Tower of Babel. And in the very next chapter, God says, okay, it's time to set this thing straight, because they're not going to do it on their own. And so in Genesis chapter 12, God calls out to a man named Abram, whose name would be changed to Abraham later on. And he says to him, make spectacular promises. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And that last line is the key piece. All peoples on earth will be blessed through Abraham and his descendants. And it works for a while. They make it to Canaan, where they're supposed to live, and the people grow a little bit, but then there's a drought, and they're forced to move to Egypt. And living there is good for a while until a Pharaoh rises up who leads them into slavery, forced labor with his city-building projects, and for 400 years they suffer under the whip as slaves in Egypt, and they cry out to God, which is then, you heard the beginning of that story, where God responds and says to Moses, you are going to go, and you are going to take this people out of slavery in Egypt. You're going to save them and bring them to the promised land. And there's that name thing that is really confusing to us. I am who I am. he kind of sounds like a jerk, like I'm mysterious. Like, you know what I'm saying? I am who I am. That doesn't sound revelatory to me. It sounds confusing. It can also be translated, I will be who I will be, which again sounds kind of standoffish. How dare you ask for my name? I will be whoever I want to be, and you will deal with it. But that's not exactly the connotation in Hebrew or how a Jew would have heard it. When he says, I will be what I will be, he's giving them a clue to look at what he does to figure out who he is. Does that make sense? I will be what I am doing. I will be what I do. Look at my actions. Look at where the sun shines to figure out what the sun means. And what does he do? Does exactly what he says. He frees the people from slavery. He breaks the yoke of the oppressor and sends them out. And again, they get to the promised land, and things are good for a little while, and then they're not. This is the story over and over again. Things are good, they're not, and then they are again. And so things are good for a while. The people call out for a king, and they get David, who they say is a man after God's own heart. And David is wonderful, but his son Solomon screws up and has something like 700 concubines. Bless his heart. I don't know. 300 wives, 1,000 women in his life, not exactly one man, one woman. But he messes things up, and he goes after idols, other gods from other nations and territories, and the kingdom of Israel splits in two. It splits into the northern kingdom, which names itself Israel, and then the smaller southern kingdom names itself Judah. And after about 200 years, the northern kingdom of Israel is overtaken and conquered by the Assyrian Empire, and parts of it are forcibly deported. And so that's the end of the northern kingdom of Israel. And the smaller kingdom of Judah struggles on for a while, but then a bigger, badder enemy comes forward called Babylon. You've heard of Babylon? The Babylonian Empire. And they swallow up Judah like a whale swallowing a minnow. I mean, there's no hope. And they take the people of Israel, of Judah, and deport them to Babylon, a large percentage of them, including the king and the king's family, and the best and brightest. They take to Babylon and force them to work again, just like Egypt, on the emperor's city-building projects. But as empires do, they tend to fall. And so the Babylonian Empire falls to the Persian Empire, and they send the Jews home, and the people celebrate. One of the Israelite poets wrote, "When we returned to Zion, our mouths were filled with songs, and our tongues with songs of laughter." And they rebuilt the temple, and everything was wonderful again, except it wasn't. It just wasn't the same. There was no kingdom anymore. They were surrounded by their enemies. One empire after another rose and ruled and oppressed them. It was Persia, and then it was Greece or Egypt or Syria, and finally Rome. Again, they were oppressed and in pain. They had this cycle going. It goes good, but then it doesn't, and then it goes good again, and then it doesn't, and they were stuck in it doesn't. And about this time, prophets started to write. And they started to envision, because when we're in times of pain, that tends to be when we come closest to God, isn't it? I mean, think about that in your own life. When have you been drawn closest to your Creator? Has it been when everything was awesome? No, usually when everything's awesome, you just don't think about it. But when you're driven to your knees, you start to actually pray. And that's what the Jewish people did. Driven to their knees by the oppression around them, prophets started to write. One of those prophets wrote a book named Daniel, named after its main character. And in it, he said, you know, God is good, and God is going to work this thing out, but it's not going to be as fast as we thought it was. It took 70 years from when we were deported to Babylon to get back to Judah. But he says it won't take 70 years, it'll take 490 years before we'll really be delivered. But when we are, God will send a judge to judge the nations, all that have devoured and destroyed. This judge will come to set things right, and he describes this judge as coming on the clouds, something like a son of man. Now there's a phrase you've heard before. Wait, somebody called himself Son of Man. But that's Daniel's vision. Something like a Son of Man, like a human being, somebody set apart, will judge between the nations. At the same time, Isaiah was writing. And he's remembering that back in 2 Samuel chapter 7, God had promised David that his descendants would rule forever. But David's descendants had failed. And so Isaiah said, well, another will rise up, a king in the line of David, the anointed one, anointed with oil as kings were, and anointed with God's Spirit to finally be the king, the line of David, the one that will bring us out. So this Son of Man will be the king. And what was the word for anointed in Hebrew? Do you know it? Messiah. The anointed one, the Messiah. And what's the word for Messiah in Greek? Christ. So one like a Son of Man, a Messiah, a Christ, would come and bring all things together. But Isaiah went a step further. He's not just going to restore Israel. He's going to go all the way back to the original exile, the original time of brokenness and creation, and bring it all back together. And he says there, see, I will create a new heavens and a new earth. The former things will not be remembered, nor will they come to mind. The wolf and the lamb will feed together. You've heard this around Christmas time, haven't you? And the lion will eat straw like the ox. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, says the Lord. So this Son of Man, this King, Messiah, Christ, Anointed One, will come and put all things right in all creation. But here's the piece that even the ancient Jews missed, that is key to understanding this whole thing. The story of Israel's history was really a story of one failure after another. All the way back to Abraham, God's people were called to be the light, to bring people together with God, but they failed to do it. So this Son of Man, this King, this Messiah, would have to be Israel, would have to himself go into exile and suffering and death and come out the other side in order to bring all things together. He would do faithfully what Israel could not. He would suffer all the way to death and then come out the other side, brought out the other side by God to bring all things together. And when he did it, the people of Israel would look at him, Isaiah said, and say, he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. Again, that's one of our readings during Lent, leading up to Good Friday and the crucifixion of Jesus. N.T. Wright sums up the entire story of Israel this way. He says, the God of Israel is the creator and redeemer of Israel and the world. In faithfulness to his ancient promises, he will act within Israel and the world to bring to its climax the great story of exile and restoration, of the divine rescue operation of the King who brings justice, the one who joins heaven and earth together, and of creation healed and restored. That's the story that you have to know if you're going to understand and make sense of Jesus. If you want to understand Jesus, you need to understand Israel. That's the story. And so, how do you do that? How do you do that? Well, how do you learn anything? Because again, if your upbringing in the church was the same as mine, and I got lots of nods when I said, is this you? Yes. We know this much of everything from Jesus' birth to the end of the Bible, and we know this much of all the rest of it. Well, it just so happens your pastor at Pastor Appreciation Month, appreciate me. I created a document this past week that says on the top of it, Israel's story, Jesus' story. And it's the story that you just heard with a little more detail, because I like detail. And I challenge you to take one home this week and read it one time every day for the next 7 days. And don't tell me you don't have time, because I timed myself reading this thing. It took me 12 minutes and 38 seconds, and I read slow. So you do have time. And again, is it not worth it? to know the story that Jesus told about himself, so that next week when we start to open up Jesus and talk about who Jesus was and what he did, you're not groping in the dark about what may have happened, but you've got right there what did. And it's just second nature, and you know it in your bones. You know the entire story, so you can actually engage with it. I mean, just imagine. Imagine if we stopped treating Jesus like the guy in the movie theater. Like we know part of his story and then we just fill in all the rest ourselves. If instead we embraced and we understood and we digested the whole story. Imagine if we knew and understood God's rescue plan for the creation so we could just go out and apply it and live it as the church. Imagine if we heard God's voice, these voices echoing around us in justice and spirituality and relationship and beauty. If, once we knew the story, all those disparate voices echoing in our minds started to take on the same tone and started to take on the same quality and started to even sound like it might be one person telling us all those things, and that person might be the one who said he fulfilled Israel's story. If you want to know Jesus, you need to know Israel. And once you do, you may know Jesus better and closer and in a deeper way than you ever have before. Amen.